this computer. Hello and welcome to the Colchester podcast with Martin Goss. My name's Craig Fuchs and we're here with episode 2 of the podcast. And today we're going to be discussing the events of the last week or so in national politics and also UK politics. And Martin's here with us to give us his insight and his thoughts on the things that have been happening. We decided that we're going to start today by talking about the changes at the very top of government in terms of Home Secretary, Foreign Secretary, which links into the government's plans of deporting, I suppose you could say, illegal immigrants to Rwanda, which has been a highly controversial plan. And it seems that we've got some legal clarity on that. So I'll hand over to Martin now and just give us a kind of an overview of what's happened so far this week in UK politics.
Well, it's been another turbulent week, clearly, in government. It seems to be every time you peel off the calendar, there's more turbulence. And obviously, Braverman has been fired, finally, after making more and more right-wing comments to the press that weren't approved by Downing Street.
This is Suella Braverman, that was the Home Secretary.
Yeah. And she's obviously gone. And now David Cameron is back. Although he's not an MP, he's because he obviously left and did a swift stage left after the Brexit vote was announced some years ago, and he's now back as the Foreign Secretary, and then we've also got James Cleverly as the Home Secretary. So there's a bit of a change going on the pitch. And I think with Cameron coming back, they're trying to portray that the Conservatives, with the year left probably before the general election, that obviously they're trying to portray that they've actually got some moderate people in cabinet, whereas everyone's been going further right, kind of hanging out in the era of Nigel Farage and UKIP, or probably even further right than them. So, you know, they've really taken the Conservative Party to the brink, to the edge, and they just are not electable. And even out on the doorsteps this morning in Highwoods, lifelong Conservatives are saying, I can't vote Conservative anymore, just cannot do it. And I'm picking this up online as well. So they pretty much destroyed not only the country, but they've destroyed their party. And I don't think they'll be re-elected for a generation. I think they'll be out of power. Looking at the opinion polls, they're really down at like 19-20% or something like that. I don't recall the Tory party being that low in the polls for many decades. So they've destroyed themselves, and I can't really see in the final year that they're going to turn it around.
Yeah. The comments that have come from, if we start with the former Home Secretary, the comments that were made, I think it was around the marches against what's going on in Israel-Palestine. About the marches being hate marches and that type of very, very inflammatory language. That, to my mind, how have we got to a stage where the Home Secretary can even conceive of people's legitimate right to protest, even though that has been impinged upon in recent times, as being hate marches? The situation in Israel is fantastically complicated. I don't know if anybody in the UK could ever say that they understood it fully. And clearly emotions are running very high on all sides. And there's been a lot of loss of life on all sides, and violence and unspeakable things that have happened on all sides. But how do we get to a stage where we have, my conceived idea of UK on the world stage is kind of moderate and hopefully a stabilising influence. I know there's a lot of evidence against that, but hopefully that's what we would seek to be. But we have a Home Secretary that could be saying this stuff about people in the UK and their legitimate right to protest.
Yeah, I think it was done purely for headlines and political career, because I think Suella Braverman was lining herself up to be the next leader of the Conservative Party when they lose in 12 months' time, or whenever they call a general election, or less than 12 months' time maybe. And I think she was lining herself up to really anchor herself to the farthest right of the party, because that's where she thinks the votes are out there, probably with the much older generation. who for them, immigration is a huge issue, and they're probably the ones that most likely voted Brexit. So I think that's where she's trying to anchor herself. I don't think it was done for any other reason. I really don't. I don't think adding to an already extremely complicated and difficult situation where there's loss of life. There's no other way to describe it. There's loss of life. There's obviously people that have been kidnapped and are still being held. Israeli and residents have been kidnapped. They're held somewhere in the Gaza Strip somewhere. Whether there will be a negotiation to return them safely, I really hope so, and I really just hope the atrocities stop and the war stops. And I think actually the ceasefire conversations that more and more leaders are coming out with, I think is the right thing. I think we've got to support stopping this as quickly as possible, because there's too many innocent people that are living in extremely poor, unsanitized conditions. I mean, I heard the sewage system had broken down in Gaza, and therefore sewage is not being pumped out. They're trying to get fuel in. I think when I saw the news last night, they're trying to get fuel in so that they can try and get generators going to actually get basic utilities working. Electricity, and sewage and everything else, and water. All of it stopped. These are third world conditions that people are living in who are innocent. Whichever side people's views are or whatever, at the end of the day, these are innocent people, tens of thousands of innocent people being affected by a war. And it's interesting because you now no longer hear anything in the news headlines about Ukraine. Occasionally it pops up somewhere halfway through the news, and it has completely stopped any reporting on Ukraine, although the atrocities there continue on a daily basis, which again is another travesty. So you are quite right, bringing it back. Britain, the UK on a global stage, used to have a very well-respected opinion and approach to the world, but I'm not really sure that we're viewed as that in more recent times, particularly with Brexit. They bring back David Cameron, who in effect wasn't a supporter of leaving the European Union, but it really was the catalyst, because he tried to play up to his own party, and it was a busted flush. He lost the vote and left. Him and George Osborne left, and then many of the things happening today, he's the architect of. So he's back, and it will be interesting to see what he does. He has been quite critical of Rishi Sunak in recent times over HS2, for instance, which we spoke about last time. So he's certainly called things out in the government, and now he's part of it again, but not an elected MP, a lord, but under parliamentary legislation, you are allowed to do that and make people ministers if they're in either house, as it were.
I did read that it is possible for the Prime Minister to call anybody that he wants, or she in that case, to cabinet. That you don't have to be an elected official. It's just kind of standard procedure that it's expected that a member of cabinet would be either a member of the House of Commons or the House of Lords.
Yeah, it is unusual and strange, but then our historic democratic processes within Westminster have got some interesting history to them. The whole thing needs a review and an update, particularly the House of Lords. But you are absolutely right, and that seems strange. Given, we go to the polls every 5 years for Parliament, or every 2 years, or every 1 year, given that we've had a number of general elections in recent years and a number of prime ministers unelected. It is strange how our democracy works, and yet our democracy is held up as one of the better systems in the world. I'm not so sure in recent times I'd agree with that.
No, nor would I. Perhaps we can come back to that in a moment. I do just want to come back to a little bit about what you said about Suella Braverman perhaps making these comments, which to my mind are incredibly inflammatory of a very difficult situation. But you said that there is perhaps a contingent within the Conservative Party, and perhaps a contingent of people that hold what we might call traditionally more right-wing views about immigration for it, and it is a huge concern. And it may well be that there's people watching, listening to this discussion that hold views along those lines. Whether you or I agree with those views isn't really important. More about what would you say to someone that holds a view, an opinion about immigration being a very real concern to them, and how they should cast their vote based on the concerns that they may have around immigration, whether that is perceived or otherwise.
So there's no question that immigration is a huge challenge and problem in the UK at the moment. And I think the problem is there's a conflation of a number of issues, because we've got genuine asylum seekers, and Afghanistan is a good example where we asked people to put their lives on the line to be interpreters when we were fighting in Afghanistan before everyone just left the whole country in an even bigger mess. And we promised those folks safety, and we promised them that we would bring them to this country and protect them, because if not, in effect, they would end up being probably killed in their own country because they've supported us. And there was a huge issue about actually getting all the promised interpreters and people that had helped into this country, and it's almost like they were just dropped. So I think there's genuine asylum seekers where their lives are in danger, and I think that's a really powerful example of where somebody's genuinely at risk of being persecuted or even murdered, potentially. Really serious words there. You've then got other migration that is the big hot topic, that really is where the incitement happens, is where people are risking their lives to come across on boats. And of course, we've had children that have lost their lives in those boats where they've drowned, and they're putting their lives at risk. So there's people trafficking going on, and within that community that's putting their lives at risk on a daily basis, there will be genuine people that are seeking asylum, but they feel it's the only way to get to the country, because we, I believe, have locked down a lot of the safe passages and routes into the UK, because we've made it much, much harder to get here. So there's that piece. And then, of course, there's also genuine migration where we need it for the economy. So we need doctors, nurses, we need people to work in the NHS, we need them to work in the hospitality industry, we need them to help get the crops out the fields. We, for many, many decades, have run our economy very healthily on people from Europe, Eastern Europe, etc., wider from wider afield, where we've needed that support in the UK, because let's be frank, people don't want to work in the fields or work in hotels or whatever, and we've lost a lot of that skill, because we've heard about the millions of pounds of crops that have rotted in fields, etc., and putting farmers' livelihoods at stake. And then we've, of course, got issues with food supply and energy supply, and it goes on, and we could spend hours talking about this stuff. Bringing it back, I think there's conflation. So what's really the answer to this? Well, let's talk about economic migration, genuine economic migration, where we've got roles here. We even had it with lorry drivers, didn't we, during COVID? We didn't have enough of them, and it meant there were blue rolls missing, or food or whatever, tomatoes or whatever, missing from our shelves, because there was nobody to actually drive them safely in and then get them on the shelves. A real live example from a couple of years ago. And so we have genuine need for migration in this country. We've got, I think it's over 100,000 jobs in the NHS, unfilled, 100,000 jobs across the UK that we simply cannot fill for, what in effect is a skilled worker to care for people, to carry out operations, to nurse people. And then, of course, more people are either leaving the NHS because they're overworked and overstressed, or underpaid, and may go into the private sector, etc. So we've got a real issue. So that's one big chunk of migration, which is absolutely key to our economy. There's no question. There's then what we've already talked about, where people are in effect putting their lives at risk, crossing in boats. People traffickers are causing this. So one of the things is going after the people traffickers and just stopping this. And people paying thousands and thousands of pounds to get across, and then in effect be detained. And then the other piece is sorting out genuine immigration where, for instance, so if somebody turns up in this country and they say, I want to claim asylum, etc., they cannot work, right? And we're talking about some potentially very highly skilled people, doctors, teachers, etc. They're people that we need in our economy without question, but they can't do anything. They're not issued a national insurance number. They cannot work without a national insurance number, and yet they want to work. Now, that would reduce somebody's self-worth. That would affect somebody's mental health. And the point is that they also can't contact the Home Office, as I understand it. You have to fill out paperwork in triplicate. It goes off to various places. And then, of course, in that time, bits of paperwork seem to get lost in the system, and you're not allowed to chase it until a year after. And then you find bits of paperwork are missing, and then you have to go through it all again. And these are people that might speak really good English. Their English may be not so strong, etc. And they've got to try and navigate their way through the complexity of the Home Office. And during that time, people may disappear. They might be working illegally because they need money, and they also want to work. But we take that right to work away because we don't issue temporary national insurance numbers. And yet we've got 100,000 jobs in the NHS, and we've got other jobs as well that are not filled. And yet we've got a workforce sitting there waiting to work. Mm. So the answer is the immigration system is broken because we're not processing that pool of people quick enough, and bits of paperwork get missed and they're not allowed to chase. So you've got a number of different areas that are related, and the system is broken, and that is fundamentally what needs fixing to help genuine migration, genuine asylum seekers, and to make the system flow much quicker. Because where people, because in that group of people, there will be people that absolutely have no right to asylum, and they will then be sent back to wherever it's agreed they'll be sent back to, whether it's France or further afield to their own home country. But the point is, if you're not processing those quick enough, and you've got a growing backlog, the whole system is on its knees. So it needs investment to clear the backlog, look after the genuine cases, deal with the cases that are not genuine, and obviously get those people removed and sent back. And I think most moderate people would support what I've said, right? They realise that there is a need for immigration, migration. There's genuine need. There is some of it that is absolutely not genuine, and that's what we need to deal with. And then there's the genuine stuff that we're just failing to deal with, absolutely failing to deal with it. And I think that's where it needs fixing, and also to deal with the people traffickers as well. And I think that would be my plan.
Okay. What about something that I would hear anecdotally is that there is a greater pressure on schools, and that there's a greater pressure on doctors' surgeries, GP practices. What could be done with that as the population continues to grow? We've got an aging population. We've got a growing population through immigration. What needs to happen in terms of the provision for facilities that are state funded, schools, hospitals?
Yeah, absolutely, and you're absolutely right. It's not just, and you've hit the nail on the head. We have an aging population. So if you take the Tendring Peninsula, its demographic is extremely elderly, and that's putting pressure on the NHS in Tendring. Colchester as well. I think the latest statistics I saw recently is it's now 1 GP per 2,000 people in North Essex. Probably one of the worst statistics in the country. And it's gone up from, I think, something like 1 doctor for 1,850 people. So we've talked about, we've got a group of people that want to work, and some of them are doctors, nurses, and yet we can't get them to be doctors and nurses or dentists or teachers, because we've got a failed immigration system and we can't process those people and we don't let them work. So one of the points is, if we did that quicker and we got them integrated and working, that would start to take care of, only, you know, in a small capacity, but everything helps. It would start to increase the workforce in those areas where there's huge pressure on all of those public services. And the other piece, of course, is to ensure that we pay our doctors and nurses properly. We've, you know, for the first time ever, I think doctors have been on strike. Junior doctors have been on strike, and then the consultants have come out more recently. That's putting more pressure on the NHS, because it's putting operations back, and the waiting list, you know, the millions of people that are waiting on the NHS now for you know, treatment, is getting worse. And in fact, that then affects the economy, because we've got more people off sick now that might be needing knee replacements, you know, what you'd call fairly standard operations now. Though those people in the community can't work because they're ill, but they're not getting seen on the NHS and they can't afford to go private. So we've got all sorts of issues going on, but you can relate them, but you can also relate the solutions. And I think that's part of it. And of course, I talked about it earlier, mental health and stress is a huge thing through many workforces, whether it's teachers, doctors, GPs, nurses, dentists even, to be fair, because they're all under pressure. And this is making people leave the profession in record numbers, in the teaching profession particularly, in the NHS. And that 100,000 vacancy level in the NHS is just going to get worse. All the sickness record or levels are going to get worse. So it's a good question, long answer, but it's really related. And it just needs more investment in ensuring that more people want to choose these as careers, because if they're not well paid, they're not pleasant environments, or their stress is too high, why on earth would you want to go in and be a teacher? Why would you want to become a GP? Why would you want to go in and be a nurse? So it's fundamentally fixing some of the basics that will then hopefully attract more people and allowing people to work that are already qualified to do those roles.
Yeah. I think what my observation of politics in the UK in the last 10 years or so is that it, instead of having a long form answer like that, where it's a multifaceted issue where various things overlap and conflate, and the systemic pressures and in terms of immigration, how the asylum system works, and what is legitimate, what isn't illegitimate, acknowledging that there are some people that will just try and abuse the UK system. That international law says that you don't have to just stay in the first country you land in, all this type of thing. My observation is that the Conservative Party, who've been in power for all that last 10 years, have tried to reduce it down to soundbite level, where it is, you know, get Brexit done, build back better, and, you know, stop the boats is the most recent one. These 3-word kind of reductive expressions. If we do this, then everything will be right. And hopefully, not hopefully, just I think that in what we've seen this week, that approach of reducing really complex problems that require significant investment and lots of thought and lots of practical solutions cannot simply be reduced down to 3 words of stop the boats. And that we've now got, you mentioned about democracy, we've now got the highest court in the land of the independent judiciary saying that the laws and the policies that are being set out by the government are illegal. And hopefully now it's time that people will be able to see, because the court is independent and is held in high regard because of its independent nature, that the government of today are, for want of a better phrase, making it up as they go along.
Completely. And I think you're right that trying to get over what the solutions are to some of the problems takes a long answer, but you can see how they're related. But unfortunately, in our media today, and the ministers and people that we've got in charge of this country at the moment, they have done exactly what you said and boiled it down to 3 words. And all it does is incites hatred. It doesn't bring together communities, and it just further adds to the issues that we've got in this country. And it's not politics that I subscribe to. I deal in facts and solutions, and yeah, I can certainly be to the point with people, because I just believe in being straight, and being factual and being honest. I don't believe in operating in any other way, and maybe that's refreshing. Maybe that's what we need.
I think the simple answer to those types of questions is that there's no simple answer.
No, exactly.
And
in fairness, if you watch Question Time, and obviously people do, although half the time the questions don't actually seem to get answered, you do get long answers. And some people are actually very genuine and very good orators, and they will actually come out with hopefully some of the things I've been talking about. It tends to be more the government that waffle and don't actually answer the question, and to be fair, they do get called out for it.
Yeah. Okay, so let's come back to Suella Braverman's replacement as James Cleverly, who was Foreign Secretary and now is Home Secretary, and his constituency is Braintree, which is quite interesting because something that's going on in the Braintree constituency is the construction of a centre, if we could call it that, for asylum seekers. It was intended to be the biggest prison in Europe, but that plan is kind of on hold or is ongoing, and currently it is a place where asylum seekers aren't not being detained, because that would be illegal. Asylum seekers can't be detained, but is a place where they are being housed temporarily. So what do you think the new Home Secretary's thoughts are going to be, A, on what's going on in his own backyard, and B, if you can, where it might go now in terms
of... It's interesting because Braintree District Council actually took, in effect, the government to court and lost, because they didn't want that in the local community, but they actually lost that case. And now I believe that there are now residents moving into that, have moved in, and I think this week there's been a protest outside by about 40 of the residents that live there, complaining about conditions. There's no internet, and there seem to be some other issues as well. So that's kind of moving forwards. Obviously, it's hitting the news at the moment, and we'll obviously have to see how that moves forwards, because I think it's going to be about 1,500 people that are going to be moved there over the period, rather than being in hotels, and they'll be centralised in one place. And I think it's only a male population as well, I think, from what I've read. So it's a particular part of the community in one place, and this again is where clearly there's already been dissent in the local community, because the council's taken the decision to court and lost. So it's going to be very interesting to see how that plays through, as the local MP hasn't really made any comment about whether he's supportive or not. One would suggest he's probably supportive of the decision, but obviously his constituents are not. I'm not saying all constituents, but clearly the reason the council took it to court is because there's obviously strong public feeling about it, and probably also making a political point. But that is moving forwards. It is very close to Colchester, and it will be something that we'll have to watch very closely to see what happens, because obviously there are people that have been in Colchester in a number of hotels. That's all coming to an end because the government has basically said the funding stops, and therefore all the people that are being held in hotels at the moment, it stops and it returns to being a hotel. And then that responsibility falls on local councils to then find accommodation and pay for it. This is the other thing, is there's no more funding. The government hasn't said, right, it's costing us X amount a week in hotel costs. We now realise that we've displaced 400 people locally, or whatever the figure might be. It then becomes the council's responsibility to deal with it, because in effect government has washed his hands of it, and so some of the people locally may end up in Braintree, possibly. I don't know. It's not something I'm involved with, but I've got obviously a bit of local knowledge, and therefore the government again has just dumped it on councils and said, off you go. And what you tend to find is some families are very big, because traditionally that's what happens in the home country. They might have 10 people in a family with quite a lot of children, and therefore the properties that you need to find, or the places you need to find, don't necessarily exist, because you can't have 10 people living in a 2 up 2 down, because it would then be considered overcrowding by law. So this is again one of those complex situations that government has failed to deal with, and it's now dumped it on local councils to deal with, and fund it at a time when councils are underfunded by £33 billion collectively. That was a figure I got from The Guardian a few weeks ago. So that's another one of those situations which is kind of swept under the carpet, and government has washed its hands of it again.
That's pretty terrifying. That. So my only knowledge of asylum seekers in Colchester were that they were being kept at the Marks Tay Hotel, which I'm pretty sure would fall outside of what would be your constituency, but it's still in the borough of Colchester, isn't it?
That's right. It is. And they're also being held in another, or housed in another hotel as well, which obviously has come to an end. So the government, so you've literally got hundreds of people that have got to be housed somewhere. Now they'll potentially, some could go to Scotland. It's wherever there is space to accommodate. But certainly some people may well end up in Braintree, possibly.
Right. So let's come back to so David Cameron is now Foreign Secretary, and I think we were talking, saying that perhaps David Cameron might be seen as perhaps a more moderate in terms of his views. My observation, and that's very, very generous of you, I think, is that this is the person that instigated Brexit under fear of UKIP kind of demolishing the Tory vote many years ago, and when he was unsuccessful in selling Brexit to the Remain to the UK electorate, then just washed his hands of the whole thing and walked away. We now have somebody that's in the House of Lords, and by parliamentary standards or laws or whatever else, cannot enter the House of Commons, so cannot be scrutinised by the opposition. He's now a member of the cabinet and representing the UK on the world stage at a time when there is huge political upheaval and wars in countries that are incredibly volatile. What's your take on this in terms of how Britain is representing itself, and the fact that we now have essentially an unelected former Prime Minister being called into bat by a new Prime Minister?
Yes, it's a very interesting decision. I think it surprised a number of people. As I said earlier, Cameron only weeks ago was criticising the government over HS2, and he's criticised them over other decisions they've made in their lifetime. So, Cameron, I think, was quite well respected in Europe and was quite well respected on the world stage when he was Prime Minister, when he was trying to get Europe to cut him some slack on things like migration, etc. There was a documentary a few years ago that actually detailed that period, and some of the European leaders were really trying to give Cameron some slack on things like that, and because they obviously didn't want the UK to leave. But now they'll be looking at him saying, well, that's interesting, isn't it? Because you, in effect, were the catalyst for this, because you did call the vote, you pressed the trigger, ultimately thinking you'd win it and to appease your party, and now look at the state of everything. So he's probably going to have lost a lot of friends and a lot of respect there, particularly in Europe, and that will reflect, I think, more on the world stage. And I think the political reason for bringing him back was the point that we've both talked about around being seen as more moderate. So he'll be trying to attack that middle ground for the votes, because he's now part of government. Whereas before he was seen as a bit of an outsider, former Prime Minister, and he was kind of throwing the odd brickbat at whoever was Prime Minister at the time to say, I don't agree with what you've done or where you're going. And I think migration was one of those things he was very critical of.
Mm. It is concerning because historically, I can only think of one other time in my lifetime where that might have happened, which was when Mandelson was brought back from the House of Lords.
Yeah, because Mandelson was fired a number of times. I've read his book, and he was a highly skilled man, but made a number of mistakes and left and joined government a number of times.
So that aside, if the Prime Minister is looking at his colleagues around him in his parliamentary party, and he's got to choose his cabinet, is he? This is just speculation, I know, but he's looking around him and going, right, I've got 4 offices of state, and I can't fill one of those jobs from my colleagues around me. I'm gonna have to go to the House of Lords to call back somebody that's been quite critical of me. That doesn't feel particularly, from choosing your sort of A squad from the best of the best of the best.
No, and I think you're right. I think he's run out of reshuffles because there's not many people now that you can reshuffle that he can probably trust, and maybe Cameron is now one of those more trusted aides to him. And as a former Prime Minister, will come with a lot of experience, which would probably be invaluable inside the cabinet at a time when you're about to go to the people. Strange now, isn't it? Now the Chancellor is talking about tax cuts. We're paying the highest taxes I think we've paid since World War II or that period. And now they've suddenly started talking about tax cuts because we're now talking about elections. Funny that, isn't it?
Yeah. Okay. So I think that's as far as we can take it in terms of what's gone on this week in national politics. Give us an overview of what's been happening recently in more local in Colchester.
So in Colchester, we continue to have to deal with obviously public finances locally, and we're going to start looking at the budget for next year, and whatever council tax rise will have to occur locally, although you can't put council tax up by more than 3% by law without holding a referendum. That's per authority, I'll add, by the way, not overall. And the investment in the city centre in Debenhams, I think, is a really positive story. I think that's really good that whole unit is going to be filled with a new set of businesses, in effect. And that's going through at the moment and is really good news for the city centre, because obviously retailers are struggling. I think I heard yesterday that the overall the retail turnover, as it were, was down again by a small percentage point on compared year on year. So the retail sector is struggling because of high interest rates and you know, everything else that's going on in people's household bills. Electricity and gas is still very expensive, etc. Everything's going up. Food is still going up, although inflation has come down. Prices are still rising. I think people forget that just because inflation is coming down, it doesn't mean it suddenly meant that that a pint of beer has gone up or
it's just going down. It's just increasing at a slower pace than it was before.
Exactly. And so there's a huge challenge, and I think what people forget is that those challenges will also affect the council, because energy prices go up. Imagine trying to heat Leisure World, the pool. That's a huge cost. And you can't keep...
Martin, I'm going to pause you there and challenge that. People pay to use Leisure World. It is a business venture. The cost of using Leisure World has increased beyond the rate of inflation, in my view. Yes, whilst that might sit under the council's responsibility, people are paying to use that facility.
You're right. But to give an example, I don't think gym memberships went up for something like 3 years because of COVID. They were frozen. So obviously the prices have been held, but now inflation has been up to 11%. We've had to increase prices. But what you can't do is you can't outprice something like Leisure World, because it's not like a David Lloyd, right? David Lloyd, you will pay a premium price and you know what you get for that. what you can't do is you can't overinflate pitch hire or squash courts or whatever.
The cost of the squash, I play a bit of squash. The cost of playing squash at Leisure World has gone from, it is now about £15 to hire a squash court for 45 minutes. And that has increased probably double in the last 5 years.
Yeah.
So there has been 100% inflation over about 5 years on the cost of playing squash. That there are a few other facilities for squash specifically. It's something I'm quite passionate about because it's my favourite thing. That if we're comparing something like Leisure World, which is a very, very important resource for lots of people,
absolutely,
and there are other businesses in that sector that are making money at a lower cost, then there's something wrong at Leisure World. And that to use your example, to heat Leisure World, it costs a lot of money, but it's been paid for by the people that use it.
Yeah, but what Leisure World also does is it offers services along with the NHS at reduced rate for people that might have had a heart attack, etc. So that's what's different about Leisure World, is it has a social responsibility as well as obviously being a place of leisure and pleasure. I use it. I will be going there tonight. I've been a customer of it for over 25 years. But it also has a social responsibility to those that can't afford, the David Lloyds and the more premium prices. So
absolutely,
and you have to try and make sure it balances the books.
Yeah, and it is something that paying customers gladly use, as I do and you do. But if we get to a stage where we can't have perhaps subsidised gym memberships to anybody that might need them, it's a bit of a sorry old state of affairs, though, isn't it?
Absolutely. No, completely agree. And that's, again, some of the challenges that obviously are dealt with at a local level, because we have to try and encourage fitness because it has so many other connotations. Diabetes is on the increase, but it's proven that obviously that fitness helps reduce diabetes down and obesity, etc.
Yeah, so we have to be careful with the language there. Type 2 diabetes.
Yes. So type 2 diabetes, and then it's all linked. So there is again with the NHS, there's partnership. There's obviously support to try and make sure people's fitness is looked after.
The more people look after their health, the better. The less likely they are to be spending time in a hospital. And
absolutely, and again, it's one of those issues that's multifaceted that is linked. And I think people again forget that. They just say, well, I go to the gym and it's costing me this much money. Well, actually there's a lot more to it. So, I think that's why most councils still have in effect some public sports facilities rather than it all being completely privatised. Really important to have that balance.
So instead of me dominating the conversation about the rise in squash court fees, which is something that clearly affects me and I've got little knickers in a twist about, tell us a bit more about what's going on what was the Debenhams site?
So the Debenhams site is going to be a leisure complex, including go-karting. And of course, we have no go-karting now because the IndyCart business that used to be at Severals went some years ago. So it's going to be a leisure complex of varying leisure facilities, which some people online have got quite aerated about, saying they'd like it to be a retailer. But of course, my challenge back is, where are the retailers queuing up to take these large units? And therefore, it's better to have something in the city centre. And city centres and town centres are changing because they're becoming much more places of social meeting places and leisure, rather than it all being about retail and shopping. And many towns and cities are all changing. It's not just Colchester. This is a whole societal thing driven by online shopping. And I know people talk about, the amount of nail bars and hair facilities. But at the end of the day, you can't buy those from Amazon. You can't go and, send your hair away to Amazon to be cut. And, so that's why. But those businesses wouldn't survive if there wasn't the trade to use them. And at the end of the day, they'll be paying business rates and they're creating employment. And this is the changing face of city centres. And so it's better that the Debenhams site and there's a number of floors in there, all of it will be taken. And therefore, that will be generating employment and it will be generating business rates, which I know go back to government, and the business rates is a whole podcast in itself, I'm sure, because that's another one of those taxes that's complex and people don't necessarily understand particularly well. But it's good investment in the city centre, and it's something different that is not elsewhere.
Yeah, I can't think of another, from what you've described it and how I sort of pictured it in my mind, I can't think of another town centre locally that would have that type of facility.
No, and therefore hopefully it will attract people from outside, and therefore it's again people buying those coffees or having meals or even staying in hotels if they come and spend the weekend in Colchester. It's a bit like when we have concerts in Castle Park. Lots of people come from outside, so therefore they're staying in hotels, they're visiting Dedham or Mersey, staying in the local facility or vicinity and using local facilities. So that money is coming in, going into the pockets of local people because they're earning or tips or local businesses, and it's investment. So all of these things are linked, and I think sometimes people forget that.
Yeah. Excellent. So some positive news then to finish up with.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. It's good to see the investment, and it's good to see these big units being taken up and not, planning applications coming in, changing them into apartments.
Yeah. Good. Anything else you've got for us this week, Martin?
No, I'm just looking forward to getting out, continuing meeting businesses, and if people or charities, if people want me to come along, have coffee, listen to any issues or challenges I can help with, happily come and meet.
Well, thank you very much for making the time today, Martin, and I'll look forward to speaking to you next time.
Brilliant. Thanks for your time too.
Yes, thanks, Martin.